Thank you for being with us today. So we'll go ahead and get everything started here. Everybody, this is Richard Johnson. He's a staff writer for Banner Society of Vox Media. Richard started out covering the University of Florida in 2013 until he graduated in 2015, covering football, baseball, and men's basketball. He's now based out of Brooklyn. You can read his writing on bannersociety.com and also hear him on the popular show podcast Ain't Played Nobody, where he covers college football with a variety of hosts. Richard's one of the few black journalists covering the sport on a national level. So really happy to have Richard here today to chat with us. So Richard, I'm going to open the floor to you to let you tell us a little bit about your background and writing and what it's like to cover college football from the aspect that you do working on a website medium.
Yeah, and I'll just say if my internet or whatever starts getting clunky, I'll just let me know and I'll just cut my camera or something like that. I have a passion for college football that goes back to, literally when I grew up. I grew up in Gainesville, Florida. It's been Gators all the way. When I was in high school, they were winning national championships in football and basketball. But I played really, really crappy high school football myself. So I've always just been more drawn to football than any other sport. And it from time I got to like high school, early college, like I've always known what I wanted to do. I always knew I wanted to cover sports. I always knew, I think the only time that I really ever wavered was I went into college thinking that I was going to do TV. And so my degree is actually telecommunications, broadcast focused. But all of the work that I did in school, it just ended up being writing. Like I ended up kind of thinking, hey, I want to do TV or radio. Was kind of thinking between the two and was more focusing on radio in the broadcast school. But I was like, man, maybe I should do a little bit of writing on the side so that I can kind of round myself out and learn just, some of the multimedia skills. Started writing and just really fell in love with it. And so then I started working in my student newspaper. I started stringing and doing like internships for local newspapers and stuff like that. And I was like, hey, like, I think I want to write. So all of my outside stuff became writing focused and became writing and kind of just fell into it. And I knew the way that SB Nation covered college football was so unique, brilliant. I looked up to guys like Spencer Hall and Jason Kirk that I now work with. I always respected the way that they covered the sport and always thought that they did it as intelligently and as uniquely as anybody else. And so I really was like, man, I want to work for these guys. And in college, I actually met them at SEC Media Days. I met Holly, Stephen Godfrey, who I now co-host a podcast with, Jason, who is now my boss, and Spencer, who I write with. Like, I met these guys and I was like, hey, let me know, like, if you guys have any openings or whatever. And, I had no idea that 3 years later they would have some openings and that they would call me. And like, well, I guess we'll kind of get into my background whenever you guys are ready for it. But they ended up calling me in one of the weirdest points in time of my entire life. And I ended up jumping on with them, and it's a decision that I will never regret.
Well, let's get into that a little bit because you touched on it, but I wanted to kind of walk us through what you did in college, then sort of what your career progression's been, and then how you got from Gainesville, Florida to Brooklyn, New York.
Yeah. So right after I graduated, I took a job with ESPN. Like the month after I graduated, I got a job at ESPN. There were no glitz or glamour. There was no, what they don't tell you when you start at ESPN at an entry level is that people don't really move up, ascend through the rankings at ESPN. ESPN comes and gets you if you are at CBS or Fox or something like that. That's how it works to get at the top of ESPN. So that's just a little nugget to remember. But at the time, I was young and idealistic and thought that, I'll do this ESPN job and I'll move up the ranks over the years. And eventually, later in my career, I will be a college football reporter for ESPN. That's kind of where I started. So at the time, I was doing some back end stuff. Like low level editing on like the alerts that you get on your phone for like a story or a breaking news thing or something. Like my team had a hand in doing those. We would surface stories to the alerts team, and the alerts team would blast it out to millions of phones. So I was doing that, and I stayed in Florida. Actually, they didn't make me move. I stayed in Florida for a year, and lived in my hometown with some of my buddies from college. And then after a year, I was like, all right, I think that I want to move to Bristol because I'm still chasing this ESPN dream. I want to continue doing it. I'm going to move to Bristol and work at HQ, ESPN HQ. And so this would have been August. So yeah, this would have been like July or August of that year that I kind of made that decision. It's probably 2016, and I was ready to move. I like was a week away from moving. I was in my parents' living room. I had all my stuff like was all over the place. Like we were literally, me and my mom were going to drive to Connecticut in a week, and I got a call from Bud Elliott, who worked at SB Nation. Like, hey, SB Nation's hiring college football reporters. Bud covered Florida State, owned a Florida State team site, and we would, we'd cross each other at Florida State games and stuff like that. And we became friends. And he was like, hey, we're hiring college football writers. We need to apply. I remember telling him I can't. That was my first response. I was like, I can't, Bud. Like, I'm moving in a week to continue to work this job for ESPN at ESPN HQ. I cannot do that. He was like, look, put the application in. We'll see what happens. So I put the application and put a resume in. Got in my car a week later, drove to Connecticut. I took my first interview with SB Nation in a hotel in North Carolina. I took my second interview with SB Nation on the floor of my apartment that had nothing in it. And then I went to work at ESPN. And my second day at terrestrial ESPN, I shook the hand of my boss and I was like, hey, I just got a job offer to go somewhere else. And I gave my 2 weeks notice. So I worked for ESPN for about a year and 2 weeks. I worked out of Bristol for about 2 weeks. And then for the next year, I had to stay in Bristol because I had to live out an apartment lease. And I could tell you from personal experience that I would not live in Bristol, Connecticut. Even if I worked for ESPN, I would advise against living in Bristol, Connecticut. But especially if you are not working for ESPN, I would imagine that I was one of the only people who worked in sports for somebody else and lived in Bristol, Connecticut. But after a year of living in Connecticut, I moved over to Brooklyn and have not looked back. So that's kind of the path. It is unconventional, but that's the road.
Well, I mean, as somebody who worked in communications out of undergrad as well before I moved into higher ed and stuff, that path is so common. Like you jump from piece to piece. And one thing I'd love for you to tell our students here is how do you prepare yourself to be able to make those quick moves like that, and then also keep your skill up and keep your networking going while you've got all these. You're trying to cover a team, you're trying to get in front of the deadline, but you need to go talk to somebody about a job and all that stuff at the same time.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is, like, I believe very strongly in like confidence in yourself. Like, you have to hold very near and dear to the fact that like you are talented. You would not be on whoever's radar if you were not talented. Like, there may be connections that got your foot in the door or whatever, but like the base level, you have a talent that they want to pay you for. This business is so topsy-turvy, particularly right now, that one of the big things is people are not gonna hold it against you that you are taking calls or whatever. Like, if they do, I mean, they just suck. Like, always pick up the phone. Never say I can't. No, don't do what I did. Don't say I can't. Thank God that the people really wanted me and were like, put in an application. Like, don't ever say you can't. Always take the phone call. Always walk down the road. Now, if it's an opportunity that you don't want, don't burn the bridge. Don't try to play factions off of each other to get raises too often. That's a hand that you can't play a lot. But always enter into discussions in good faith and and walk down the road with people and hear people out, because like an opportunity that somebody may be pitching you that may not work for you for whatever reason, whether it's you like where you live, you like where you work, whatever, like it may not be the right time for you to jump or whatever, that something like that may come in the future. And or you may be able to incorporate something that someone else wants you to do at the place that you currently are. And so it like we're journalists, we talk to people. Don't limit that to just the job you are at. Always have the conversation when someone picks up the phone, and whether it's kind of tepid interest in you or whatever. Always play those conversations out, and at least walk down the road a little bit with people.
And you had mentioned you had met Jason Kirk and Spencer Hall and some of the folks you work with now and Holly Anderson at SEC Media Days, which for those that don't know, that's like a big deal in the South with Southeastern Conference Media Days. It's a spectacle. I lived in Alabama for most of my life, so I know the craziness that can be around the summit in Birmingham and around the Winfrey and everything. But what was it like for you to network with folks that you knew you wanted to work with someday? What was your approach, and some things that you did that maybe some of our students could replicate and try as they are hitting into the workforce and starting to intern and network and such?
Yeah, I think the best anecdote there is actually how I ended up at ESPN. I was my senior year of college. I was freaking out about what was going to happen after I graduated. Didn't have a job, didn't know what I was going to do. It was March. I went to cover the NCAA tournament. Florida was actually not in the NCAA tournament that year, but I went to cover the regional was in Jacksonville, so it was an hour and a half. So I was like, all right, I'll just go and I'll write something up for our student newspaper, like whatever, like I'll go watch some basketball. Great game, actually. Buzzer beater by Georgia State to beat Baylor. Great game. And I remember I had a conversation with some people who were, they were alums of my student newspaper, but one of the guys worked for the AP. His name's Mark Long. The other one, Andrea Adelson, she works for ESPN. And so I was eating lunch with them because I knew them. They had been around the Florida football team a little bit. So I knew them, and, they were nice. And I was sitting down eating lunch with them before one of these games started. And I had that whole spring been emailing, I was emailing ESPN people. I was emailing the Tampa Tribune. The Tampa Tribune sports editor got an email from me every Monday morning for like 6 or 7 weeks. That was like my resume and everything. That paper folded a year later, so I guess it's good that I didn't get that job. But I was blasting out my information to anybody and everybody that I could think of. And one of the people was a woman named Lauren Reynolds at ESPN, and I had met her at something. But I was sending her my resume. I was like, hey, do you need somebody to cover the Gators or whatever? Like, I live in Gainesville. I can help you guys out, whatever. She was like, well, we don't need that, but I'll keep you in mind. So I was at lunch with Andrea before this basketball game, and Andrea was like, oh, I know Lauren. Like, we used to work together. I can put in an ask to see if she's got anything now. This was like 2 months later. And she was like, look, give me your number. I'll be in Gainesville next week at a hiring fair, and find me, and we'll see if I can get you plugged in. And that's what happened. The next week, I met with Andrea at this hiring fair at the journalism school, and she was like, "All right, give me your stuff." And she got Lauren on the phone, and Lauren at that point had just taken a new job, and luck has it, she was at that point in time finally looking for people to staff it up. And so I got the job at ESPN. And so that shake every hand. Like the thing that, you may think that, oh, I'm a student journalist, they don't give a shit about me. Like the thing that you need to remember is it is really flattering to professional journalists that student journalists want to talk to them. You may not think that you have a platform or that you have anything to give them. If nothing else, you are stroking their ego when you say, hey, I really look up to you, I like your work, all that kind of stuff, here's my name and Twitter handle, whatever. If that's all you do, people don't forget that. Really and truly, people do not forget that. And particularly in journalism, because everybody knows how topsy-turvy it is. I mean, look, I got furloughed last week. It's a mess. like everybody knows that the industry is so much upheaval, and because of that, there are people are so like ready, willing, and able to lend a helping hand, whether that's sending an email on your behalf, or CCing, or email introducing you to somebody. People are really ready, willing, and able to help in this industry, and it's something that I've found really heartening throughout my time in it.
That's fantastic, Richard. Thanks for. I'm going to remind our group again, if you've got questions, you can put them in the chat or unmute your microphone. Go ahead and fire a question to Richard. And while we're waiting on you guys to gather those together, I'll ask you one more. When you say you got your stuff together and you're sending it to somebody, kind of walk through what a modern portfolio looks like. Because Richard, when I was in journalism school, that was a real different time than it is now. So I mean, we're talking about, I was in the 1990s, the late 90s, early 2000s. So it's a totally different world now. What's that look like for a modern journalist to have your stuff together to get to somebody?
Yeah, I was not going to the newspaper and cutting out my articles. That was not it.
Yeah.
Like I it's weird because you have so much volume of work, and you're like, I want to give everything to somebody. The reality of the situation is, if you're emailing a hiring director or something, like, they are getting a lot of clicks. So always have your best. Some people say 3, some people say 5. Like, I kind of settled on 5. It's a good round number. So I would kind of just basically always have my 5 best stories. It's weird because it's tempting to put your 5 most recent, because everybody thinks your 5 most recent is your 5 best. But it can kind of help to show a progression of your career if you have at least one that's from like a year or 2 ago, where you can say, hey, this is what I was doing. And if nothing else, you can show a progression of, hey, this is how far I've come in the last year or 18 months or whatever. So if you're multimedia, it's a little bit different. Like, I actually never made a reel. So like, I can't speak to making a reel. I have friends who did, and they, it was 2 minutes of their best kind of stand-ups and whatnot. But I'm not the best person to speak to a reel. I didn't have a website. I never made a website. That's, I know, something a lot of people do. I never actually did that. I basically always kind of kept a running sheet of my articles, because I was just more article based. So I would just make sure that I had my articles and could shoot 5 links to whoever, whenever.
That's very cool. When you're covering college sports or covering a team, even, what are some of the challenges that you didn't know when you got into doing it, that you learned along the way, that if you could go back and tell yourself 5 years ago, oh, remember to do this instead of this, what would that be?
Yeah, covering a team is fundamentally different than being national. I am national now, and it is very different. Like Florida's my alma mater. I love it to death, but there are times when I can't watch Florida. I can't do it. I don't have the time. Or if they're not good, they're not on my radar. At least my immediate radar on Saturdays. My thing is, if you've got a sport, find a thing that you are interested in within that sport that you can just obsess over, and that you can create a niche that where there may not even be one. You can create a niche and a skill set that can become marketable. I am really into football scheme, really into it. I played bad high school football. I wish I cared about the sport intellectually as I did when I was in high school. I probably would have been a better player. But I'm insatiably curious with the strategy of football. So I have built that into my brand, I hate that word, but I have built that into my skill set, what I can do, what I want to do. And it's when someone asks, you may have a job interview or whatever, like, I've always found it kind of helpful to be able to, so I'll tell you guys this, like, I turned down a job at Sports Illustrated about a year ago. But when I went through that interview process, they got to the point where they offered me. But when I'm walking through the interview process, I was able to do 2 really key things. I was able to say, hey, this is how I fit into the constellation of your existing college football coverage. I say, hey, you guys do these 2 or 3 series. Here is how I would build on those series if I was working today for you. I would do these 3 stories in this series, and these 2 in this series. I would have that, but then I would also say, hey, this is my skill set. This is what I'm passionate about. This is what, and you kind of have to play a little 3-dimensional chess here, because you kind of have to be able to say, this is something I'm curious about and have chased a little bit at SB Nation. And if you give me the runway, I can chase it differently and uniquely for you at Sports Illustrated at the time. I was saying, hey, I do scheme this way at SB Nation. If I took off the shackles and I didn't have this other stuff to do, I could do scheme for you like this. Now, was that a little bit of a fib? Sure. But I mean, whatever. Like, you kind of got to do what you got to do. But so those are the 2 things. Like, find, and for editors and hiring managers and stuff like that, like, when you tell them that you are familiar with their content already, it makes them more comfortable, because they're, okay, I'm not bringing in a stranger here. At the base level, they kind of know a little bit of how we do what we do. So that's kind of the thing that I tell people. Have something that you're passionate about that you can bring to the table that is new, and then it's something that whatever outlet or station or whatever is not doing, and then figure out, on the other hand, a way that you fit into what they are doing. Kind of have both of those things.
I'm glad you mentioned that too, because you've worked at ESPN, you worked at SB Nation and Banner Society, Vox Media now, and you've had conversations with Sports Illustrated and a lot of other people. All those places have a very different style to themselves. I mean, even Fox covers stuff different than the way ESPN does and everything. So how is it that you can maintain kind of what you do as a writer and your brand, like you talked about, and still fit it with all those places? Is it just knowing kind of what they do? And then how can you also maintain your unique flair with that? Because that's something you've done throughout your career.
Being at Vox Media and being at SB Nation has, I think the biggest blessing of it is it's a blessing and a curse, but the blessing is we don't have rights fees. We don't broadcast games. So it's deeper than saying I can say whatever I want. It is, I can build myself in the way that I want, because I'm not shackled to rights fees. I don't, like, if I worked at ESPN and I pissed off Ohio State, there's probably going to be some ramifications there. That's not to say you are not true to yourself when you work at ESPN and you don't try to carve out a niche there. But, like, there are things that I tweet now that I cannot tweet if I worked at ESPN. Like, I'm a free spirit, free thinker, all that kind of stuff. Like, you have to play ball. Like, when the mouse is signing your checks. Like, that's just the game. So that is the blessing, being able to do it, and that is kind of the carve out there that new media has been able to do. It's like, hey, you can build a brand here, and it doesn't have to be attached to a Fox or an ESPN or an ABC or whatever, somebody that has rights fees. Like, just because we don't broadcast games, we can be unique about our content to shoulder program those games. And so that's what I think has been really nice about that. There are ways that I would have to maintain my uniqueness and my flair and that kind of stuff if I went to an Athletic or I went to Sports Illustrated. But the other thing is, on the flip side of that, when you create something that people see as unique, people have more kind of, people give you more leeway to be unique. Like, if you are like everybody else and they come and get you, then they're expecting everybody else because you're like everybody else. But if you have something that people understand is different, like, a new place makes space for that, because they are bringing you in. Like, if they wouldn't make space for that, then why are they bringing you in? Because they're not bringing the best or the actual version of you into their org or their outlet. They're bringing in a clone, or they're bringing in a dulled down or a dumbed down version. And at that point, why are you going?
That's an excellent point. And you mentioned earlier, and I'll go ahead and remind our group, if you've got questions, go ahead and chime in. This will be the last one I ask, and then we'll open it up for some final things and questions from the group. But you mentioned earlier you were furloughed. You're part of that furlough from Vox Media last week. So that's unfortunately a common thing that happens to a lot of journalists these days because of the way media is structured and stuff. What is it you do in the time in between when you're not going to be working for the main job, but obviously you're not going to go away because you write prolifically? How do you keep yourself sharp and moving forward, and what's good advice you can pass on to our students who may have lost an internship or something like that during all this COVID stuff?
Look, great question. I'm about to find out. I'll tell you this, and I'll tell you about layoffs and all that kind of stuff. Look, I'm not going to treat you like children. You're going to get laid off in this industry. It's going to happen. That is cold water and that is scary. But let's take the kid gloves off here. Like at ESPN, I left a job at ESPN. When I went to SB Nation, I left a job at ESPN that a year later got cut. Whole team that I was with got cut a year later, 10 months, I think. I turned down a job at Sports Illustrated primarily because they were being sold and there was some indecision about when they were going to be sold. And I didn't know who the new owners were going to be. And I was worried about that. Well, they got sold to some people who suck. And I'm glad that I didn't go there for that, just based on what's happened there. Now, yeah, it ended up that I'm getting furloughed for 3 months. Not quite sure if my job's going to be there on the back end at all, or if it's going to be there, if it's going to be substantively the same as it's been the last 2 years, 3 years. So, the indecision right now is there for me. So it's a temporary layoff is what a furlough actually really, the legal definition of it is. But I say it to say it is now time for me to find out what I am going to do in the next 3 months. I've had some conversations with a couple of my colleagues who are going to be furloughed, and what if we can do something together. That's something that will come. We'll kind of continue to keep going over the next couple of days. Hopefully, we have something by the time our furlough period starts. I think creatively, just on another end, like I'm gonna probably write some poetry or something. It's something that I've been kind of like a little bit interested in doing, perhaps like creatively, and never really like drilled down and got around to it. But now's maybe the time that I can do that too. So like I'm gonna have to figure out and balance how to flex different creative muscles to kind of keep myself sane. Also set myself up for the best case scenario, which is my job comes back in the same way. Set myself up for disaster scenarios. My job is not there August 1st. Set myself up for other scenarios. Someone comes and gets me within the next 3 months. What do I do then? What do I have to show then? There are a lot of moving parts that go into it. So yeah, the answer to the question of what are you going to do over the next 3 months right now is I don't know, but I am actively starting to find that out. That's been kind of the big work over the last few days, just last couple days this week, kind of figuring out what it is that I should be doing and we should be doing as a unit over the next 3 months.
Very cool. Thank you for being so fair and transparent with us about that. I know it's not the easiest thing to have to talk about, but it, like you say, it is the life of the journalist, and we've I've lived through that too. So that's why I switched careers. So ultimately, a lot of other things went into it too, gang. But I saw that as well. I worked in newspapers and stuff back when it was all print and all that good stuff. So questions from our group. If anybody's got any, go ahead and pop in and ask them, and we'll take questions from the crowd. If you want to unmute or put them in the chat, you can. Well, Richard, any last piece of advice for our students that are here today, and then anybody that may watch this on the back end that going into sports writing in particular, journalism, new media, things like that?
Yeah, I like the first thing I can offer, and Jay, I can give you my stuff and you can give with your students. Like, hit me up about anything. Like send me an email, shoot me a DM on Twitter. Like whatever, any way I can help you guys, just holler. Any advice or whatever. Want to just talk about ball? Let's talk about ball. So do not hesitate at all to holler. It's funny, I was at UNC Charlotte in February. I was hanging out with Will Healy for a few days. And that story never got published. And it's now in a silo because the world went to hell. And so it's kind of weird to post a coach profile right now. But I say that to say, if I get a new job, I'm going to have to do some additional reporting in order to publish that story. So I will be back in the Queen City at some point in time. And Jay, we'll break bread, and I'd love to talk to your class in person. Hopefully, we're back to in-person teaching and learning and hanging out and all that stuff.
Oh, that would be fantastic. I met Godfrey at the spring game, the first Healy spring game, actually. So it's the first time I realized how tall he was. So yeah, but very cool. Richard, I put your Twitter handle in the chat here or whatever. If you want to shoot me a message with your stuff, I'll send it out to the folks, let them know how they can connect with you on LinkedIn or whatever else you got going on. But thank you so much for being here and sharing time with us. And hope to see you back down in Charlotte very soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jay.
All right, guys, thank y'all for being here. Just let us know if you need anything. You can stay connected to the Career Center at career.uncc.edu. Everybody have a great afternoon.